over 8 lengthy, successive years, stretching across various chaotic political cycles and a quickly changing American cultural landscape, Ben Shapiro had continuously and openly presented a standing $10,000 proposal to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for an official, moderated political debate. The history of this unanswered challenge had grown a constant undercurrent in modern political discourse. Back inside the politically tense environment of 2018, when she remained a newly formed political phenomenon, she arrogantly waved away the challenge, formally identifying it as just catcalling on social media and bluntly refusing to participate. Undaunted by the public rejection, he extended the official invitation once again in 2019, only to be thoroughly ignored by her expanding political operation. The sincere request for a public dialogue proceeded steadily and methodically through the unprecedented years of 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, and 2025. Yet she thoroughly overlooked him every single time, treating the challenge as beneath her legislative dignity. However, the political arithmetic altered dramatically in the year 2026 as the crew managing her highly anticipated 2028 presidential campaign finally assessed the scenario and accepted the challenge. They had come to the harsh realization that constantly dodging a public debate for 8 long years was an indefensible visual for a candidate seeking the highest executive office in the land. It projected a certain vulnerability that a presidential campaign simply could not afford to carry. She eventually agreed to the confrontation, yet only under a highly specific set of structural conditions: a strict 1-hour time span, a completely unbiased veteran moderator, a live in-person audience to absorb the atmosphere, absolutely no pre-written statements or teleprompters allowed, no legal counsel present to interfere, no supportive committee staff hovering in the wings to hand notes, and, most crucially, absolutely no luxurious 12-second breaks of comfortable, shielded silence. Meanwhile, the guy stationed calmly at the opposing podium had spent an entire 8 years meticulously preparing his intellectual weapons for this exact singular dialogue. He famously processes information and speaks at a staggering, rapid-fire rate of 200 words per minute, a speed that functions as both a blade and a shield in the arena of public discourse. Throughout her career in Congress, AOC had successfully weathered a gauntlet of adversarial interrogations. She had survived Senator J.D. Vance's relentless statistical barrages, navigated Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s folksy and meandering philosophical quotations, endured Speaker Mike Johnson's strict pedagogical academic-style grading of her proposals, and withstood Donald Trump's uniquely imposing and theatrical silences. Yet, despite this extensive experience under fire, she had absolutely never been forced into a structural format where remaining silent was entirely stripped away as a viable defensive tactic. Within the unforgiving boundaries of this specific debate format, she was structurally compelled to provide immediate answers, and providing direct, unvarnished answers was the exact vulnerability her 8 years of highly choreographed congressional committee hearings had meticulously conditioned her to escape. The physical environment of the stage was fundamentally and completely unlike any congressional hearing room she had ever inhabited. There was absolutely no elevated, imposing wooden desk meant to visually establish authority. There was no polished mahogany witness table to hide beneath. There was no heavy wooden judge's gavel to abruptly stop an uncomfortable line of questioning, and there were no partisan committee members positioned high above the testifying witness to offer procedural rescue. There was absolutely none of the recognized institutional architecture that is so carefully and thoroughly designed to make one specific figure appear inherently powerful while rendering the other person completely answerable and subservient. Instead, the stark layout comprised merely of two completely identical minimalist black podiums, spaced exactly 10 feet apart on a wide, undecorated stage located at the prestigious Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. This deeply historic and hallowed forum had hosted some of the most fierce, defining disagreements between towering ideological opponents since long before either of the two debaters on stage was ever born. A highly respected veteran journalist, carefully selected as the sole moderator through mutual agonizing agreement following 3 intense weeks of back-and-forth negotiations, sat at a simple, undecorated desk positioned directly midway between the two imposing podiums. The live audience, comprised of exactly 750 tightly packed, completely sold-out seats, a quantity that had been instantaneously snatched up by the public in a mere 4 minutes and aggressively scalped on secondary markets for upwards of $2,000 a ticket. This lively, energized crowd filled the forum's tiered, steep seating, creating an intense amphitheater effect. The unparalleled cultural magnitude of the event meant that every single major television network transmitted the debate live to millions of homes, while the digital realm of the internet streamed it even faster across every conceivable social media platform. A really staggering, record-breaking 30 million viewers were already intensely tuned in, waiting with bated breath before the neutral moderator even managed to fully conclude her brief opening introduction. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood confidently and resolutely at the left podium. She was flawlessly dressed in a sharp, dark blazer paired with a crisp, professional white shirt, the definitive, carefully focus group uniform of a powerful woman actively auditioning for the presidency of the United States. However, her physical posture was notably different from her standard, comfortable stance during congressional committee hearings. She was standing fully upright instead of sitting comfortably in a leather chair. Her hands were entirely free rather than resting flat and securely on a massive wooden table. And there was absolutely no defending attorney hovering directly behind her shoulder to whisper legal advice. There were no loyal, fast-typing staff members slipping her written notes with counter-arguments, and there was absolutely no complex, arcane committee procedure she could hide inside when the pressure mounted. It was just her, a single live microphone, and the intensely focused man standing directly across from her at the right podium, the guy who had been eagerly and enthusiastically waiting for this exact specific moment since the morning of the 9th of August, 2018. Ben Shapiro stood strongly and resolutely at the right podium wearing a tailored, regular, dark suit. He brought absolutely no physical notes to the stage. He had no manila folders, no heavy legislative binders, and no visual aids of any kind. There was totally nothing resting on the surface of his smooth, black podium aside from one single, clear glass of water, which he purposely and strategically would not touch for the entire duration of the punishing hour. His hands rested calmly and naturally at his sides. He radiated a very specific, highly unnerving stillness, the distinct, deeply confident immobility of a veteran debater who absolutely does not require written notes because all the necessary information, statistics, and historical context are already constantly stored in his head. His huge mental archives were strictly organized by subject matter, meticulously cross-referenced by specific dates and quotes, and fully primed to be deployed at a blistering, overwhelming quickness that his political adversaries typically cannot equal, and which his massive, loyal audiences have fully come to expect and demand. According to the agreed-upon rules, AOC was the first to speak. The moderator had strictly assigned each participant a strict 2-minute window for an opening statement. Ben, I am going to be entirely truthful and straightforward with you tonight, she began, her voice echoing clearly through the hushed auditorium. I ultimately agreed to this debate because I strongly want the American public to observe, up close and exactly what modern conservative media truly looks like when confronted in person outside of a comfortable studio. You have built an entire, highly profitable career out of speaking incredibly fast, loudly yelling at entirely unprepared college students on university campuses, and selectively clipping the clumsy answers of people who simply aren't prepared for your specific brand of aggressive rhetoric. Let us see exactly how you do when forced to stand toe-to-toe with a sitting United States Congresswoman who has been successfully executing this job for 8 intense years. She purposely and dramatically paused. It was the highly calculated campaign pause, a momentary pausing of speech, perfectly optimized in time to create a clean, viral video clip that would inevitably travel widely across TikTok and X. I am absolutely not one of your frightened, nervous college freshmen, and this historic stage is most definitely not your personal podcast. The progressive sector of the audience, which accounted for approximately half of the occupied seats in the room, exploded into a massive wall of sound. It was a deafening, raucous applause, the distinct, aggressive noise of devoted supporters who had purchased incredibly expensive tickets with the sole, desperate hope of watching their favored congressional champion thoroughly and publicly dismantle a prominent conservative podcaster. Shapiro, however, did not wait for the audience's enthusiastic applause to diminish. He did not even wait for the neutral moderator to verbally prompt him to begin his allotted time. He began speaking at the exact, unyielding velocity he always utilized, incredibly fast, surgically precise, and completely unwavering. It was the rapid, machine gun speed of a veteran debater who has meticulously trained his vocal cords to keep exact pace with his racing, analytical mind, and whose mind absolutely does not halt or stumble to facilitate the cheers of a rivaling crowd. Congresswoman, back in August of 2018, I publicly offered you $10,000 to an educational foundation of your choice to involve in this very conversation, he stated, his voice cutting cleanly through the lingering cheers. You publicly replied, and I am quoting your exact tweet for the record right here, just like catcalling, I don't owe a response to unsolicited requests from men with bad intentions. You directly and definitely compared a formal request for a policy debate to an act of sexual harassment on the street. He stared directly and unflinchingly at her, locking eyes across the 10 feet of empty stage. Yet, remarkably, you are standing right here tonight, exactly 8 years later. Therefore, logically, either my original 2018 debate invitation was not actually catcalling after all, in which case you currently owe a profound public regret to every single woman in this country who has genuinely been catcalled for completely minimizing their traumatic lived experience, or you have knowingly and happily decided to respond to a catcaller and validate his harassment. Which one is it? The sharp, incredibly pointed question landed squarely in the room before the progressive applause for AOC had even completely faded away. This specific, coinciding timing was highly deliberate on his part. Shapiro had intentionally projected his voice forcefully into the applause, rather than waiting politely for silence, ensuring that his biting inquiry arrived while the auditorium was still mentally processing the high of her initial attack. The progressive segment of the crowd, which had been cheering so loudly just moments before, suddenly fell completely and uncomfortably quiet. They did not go quiet because the question was emotionally destructive or offending, but rather because the question purely and logically demanded an answer, and providing that specific answer required her to publicly choose between two equally terrible no-win options. AOC's hands, the very hands that had rested so freely and confidently at her sides during her initial standing debate posture, the highly trained hands meant to animatedly gesture, passionately point, and elegantly conduct the energy of the room in the exact way she typically commanded congressional hearing rooms, suddenly moved. Her right hand lifted to begin a huge, broad gesture. Utilizing the open palm extension she frequently and effectively deployed when claiming a strong moral claim, but it suddenly froze, hovering awkwardly in midair. That specific hand had been deeply conditioned by 5 separate, grueling congressional hearings to remain perfectly still when under direct pressure, and that ingrained institutional stillness training was now actively warring against her political debate training, which demanded fluid, confident physical gesturing. Her hand hovered rigidly at chest height for roughly 1 full second, the exact duration required for a human body's nervous system to process clearly opposing biological instructions. It then slowly and heavily lowered to the top of the wooden podium, where her fingers tightly grasped the hard edge. She firmly, physically grasped the podium across 5 different highly advertised hearings covering 4 intense months. AOC had never once visibly gripped any object in a defensive manner. Her hands had previously rested flat on tables. They had instinctively tightened during tense moments. They had casually checked for a wedding ring, and they had confidently reached for a smartphone, but they had never tightly gripped. In a formal hearing room, gripping a physical object transmits a sense of visible, unquestionable desperation to the cameras. On a standard debate stage, gripping the podium is entirely normal behavior. Practically everybody grips podiums at some point. However, tightly gripping the podium a mere 30 seconds into a massive presidential-level debate, long before the very first substantive policy question has even been formally asked, is highly unusual. It was far too early in the fight, and this early white-knuckled gripping was her physical body's underlying, overwhelming method of screaming to the world, "I deeply require a tether right now, and I need it right this exact second." Shapiro did not patiently wait for her to organize a careful, focus-grouped response regarding the disastrous catcalling trap. He allowed the uncomfortable, echoing question to hang in the silent air for exactly 3 seconds, and absolutely not a moment longer, because the strict rules of the debate format explicitly prohibited the luxurious, tension-breaking 12-second silences so common in congressional hearing rooms. He flawlessly and pitilessly shifted to his next point. "Congresswoman, let us talk specifics about the Green New Deal." He violently pivoted, changing the subject but maintaining the exact same blistering velocity. "This is your ultimate primary legislative proposal, initially introduced to massive fanfare in February of 2019. It is widely considered by economists to be the single most aggressive and costly climate and economic suggestion in the entire history of the American nation. Its projected total cost ranges anywhere between $51 trillion and $93 trillion over a typical 10-year period, depending entirely on which specific macroeconomic model is applied. The American Action Forum, the Tax Foundation, and the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office all firmly place the cost within that massive, unprecedented register. But for the sake of our argument tonight, let us be generous and utilize the absolute lowest possible end of that spectrum. $51 trillion, the total federal revenue, meaning every single gathered tax dollar collected by the United States government from every citizen and enterprise, equates to approximately $4.4 trillion per year. Your specific proposal demands $51 trillion over 10 years. That required sum is roughly 11.6 times greater than the entire annual revenue currently generated by the federal government. When a prominent journalist on the program 60 Minutes directly inquired how you actually plan to finance this unbelievable cost, you arrogantly laughed and stated that your critic sounded like the mythical antagonist, Dr. Evil. He fixed his intense, unblinking gaze directly on her. "Congresswoman, I assure you with total certainty that I am not Dr. Evil. I am simply a logical person holding a standard mathematical calculator. And this calculator clearly and heartlessly demands that $51 trillion over a decade minus your $4.4 trillion in total federal revenue per year creates a massive financial shortage of roughly $7 trillion every single year, for which you have absolutely failed to identify any workable, sensible funding source in the real world. Where exactly is the $7 trillion coming from every single year, AOC? AOC issued a response. She fired back immediately because the live, high-stakes debate format strictly demanded it. Maintaining a graceful silence simply was not a viable option when millions were watching. While a sleepy committee hearing room kindly permits 12 full seconds of quiet thinking before answering, a live debate stage featuring a massive audience and 30 million television viewers permits roughly 2 seconds at absolute most before the silence becomes deafening. The astounding, undeniable cost of executing the necessary elements of the Green New Deal must be closely and morally measured against the catastrophic, world-destroying cost of complete communal passivity, she argued passionately, falling back on her strongest rhetorical framing. Unchecked climate change is predicted by scientists to cost the global economy an estimated $23 trillion by the year. I did not ask you a philosophical question about the theoretical cost of inaction. Shapiro loudly interrupted, cutting her off. I specifically and mathematically asked you about the missing $7 trillion for your action. The sudden disruption was remarkably clean. It was not openly rude or shouting, but it was incredibly, overwhelmingly fast. Shapiro's sharp, clear voice caught the tail end of AOC's sentence before her thought had even fully established its intended rhetorical direction. It was exactly like a speeding sports car violently merging into a tight highway lane before the lane's previous occupant had completely vacated the space. The verbal merge was flawlessly precise. It silently communicated a horrifying message. I know exactly where your rhetorical sentence is headed. I have heard you say it 100 times, and I am simply not allowing you to go there tonight. The financial and human cost of global inaction is an entirely different, complicated conversation for another day, he pressed relentlessly. I am directly inquiring about the actual mathematical cost of your proposed action, your specific action, your primary legislative proposal. It costs a minimum of $51 trillion. You are fundamentally mathematically short by $7 trillion every single year. Please drop the talking points and provide me with a physical, realistic funding mechanism. AOC's hands nervously shifted their position once again on the hard wooden podium. Her tight grip slightly loosened, abruptly re-gripped the edge, and then loosened once more in a panicked sequence. It was the deeply unconscious, frantic rhythm of human hands desperately trying to discover a physical position that mimicked a feeling of total control, only to quickly and terrifyingly discover that the podium was completely refusing to provide that solace. What if we implemented an extreme new tax system that taxed every single billionaire in America at a rate of 100%, she countered, her voice rising slightly. If we violently took absolutely everything they had, that is absolutely not a tax rate. That is the complete, unprecedented seizing of private assets, Shapiro quickly and factually corrected. But let's say you somehow ignore the Constitution and actually do that. Let's say you take every last dollar. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, you strip all of them of everything. How much funding do you actually expect to raise? He immediately answered his own rhetorical question before she could process the math. You raise exactly $4.7 trillion, and that is a one-time, singular collection event, not a continuing annual revenue stream. It only happens once because after you forcefully take everything they own, they have absolutely nothing left for you to take the following year. So you have successfully raised $4.7 trillion, yet your own legislation dictates that you desperately need $7 trillion per year. Confiscating the entire aggregate wealth of every single American billionaire pays for roughly 8 short months of your legislative proposal. After that point, all the money is completely drained, the billionaires are entirely broken gone, and your proposal is still facing a massive, unconquerable $6.3 trillion deficit in its very first year. Therefore, I will politely ask you once again, without the movie references, where exactly is the money coming from? AOC desperately attempted a tactical rhetorical pivot. It was the exact same well-rehearsed pivot she had successfully employed in every single congressional hearing when pressed on specifics. It was the classic emotional pivot toward encompassing moral values. The underlying question here tonight is not actually about highly specific, granular funding mechanisms, she passionately argued, trying to raise the tone. It is fundamentally about whether we, as a compassionate and forward-thinking society, it is absolutely about specific funding mechanisms, Shapiro interrupted yet again, shutting down the emotional appeal. You explicitly and loudly proposed a highly specific financial amount in your bill. $51 trillion is a very specific, literal number. Specific, massive numbers demand specific, realistic funding mechanisms. You simply do not get to proudly propose the single largest government expenditure in all of recorded human history, demand everyone vote for it, and then casually ignore the math by claiming it is merely about moral values. Fuzzy moral values do not pay the government's bills. Tangible financial mechanisms pay bills. Provide me with a mechanism. AOC's verbal response speed was visibly worsening with every passing second. Her initial, angry answer to his first question had been lightning fast. Her second response suffered a noticeable, awkward, half-second delay. Her third attempt, the failed pivot toward societal values, suffered a painful, agonizing full-second delay. Each consecutive delay represented her brain's cognitive processing time dramatically increasing as her internal menu of available effective rhetorical responses rapidly reduced to zero. In a standard hearing room, this internal cognitive processing time remains entirely unseen to the public. The witness comfortably sits, the massive room patiently waits, and the television cameras quietly absorb the quiet moment. On a live debate stage, however, processing time is glaringly, brutally visible. The live audience actively sees the hesitation in the eyes, clearly hears the desperate verbal filler words, and intensely feels the widening, terrifying void between the sharp question and the answer that is simply not coming. Congresswoman, you have served in the United States Congress for 8 full years. Shapiro unyieldingly continued, sensing the blood in the water. In those 8 years, you have utterly failed to produce a single viable funding mechanism for your own signature legislative proposal. You haven't produced a detailed economic white paper. You haven't submitted a formal request for an official CBO score. You haven't drafted a comprehensive mathematical plan. You aggressively proposed spending $51 trillion, demanded the country reorganize its entire economy, and then literally offered a pop culture movie reference as your only defense. And tonight, standing here on this stage 8 years later, you still do not possess a mathematical answer. The progressive wing of the audience sat in stunned, horrified silence. They were not acting hostile. They were simply processing reality. They were deeply processing the brutal math. It was the exact way a person processes complex, undeniable math when someone slowly works it out on a chalkboard directly in front of them, realizing with sinking dread that the cold numbers do not lie, even though they desperately wish they did. Congresswoman, I would like to try an experiment right now, Shapiro stated, his tone shifting to something almost medical. I am going to ask you a rapid series of incredibly uncomplicated yes or no questions. These are underlying, basic questions that any serious presidential candidate, which you are reportedly aiming to become in 2028, should easily be ready of answering using just one single word. AOC's chin stubbornly lifted. It was her signature debate, chin the proud, inflexible physical posture of a determined woman who has just been told she cannot do something and is thoroughly prepared to fight to prove that she can. Go right ahead, she challenged bravely. Do you currently still support the policy of defunding the police? He asked immediately. Her chin remained firmly elevated, but the verbal answer did not arrive immediately. The truth behind the scenes was highly complicated and politically poisonous. In the fiery summer of 2020, she had loudly and proudly supported defunding law enforcement across the nation. However, in 2021, violent crime rates across her own specific congressional district had drastically and terribly spiked by 22%. By 2022, she had quietly erased the word defund from her official campaign website entirely. In 2023, she had carefully focus grouped and rebranded the notion as reimagining public safety. Accordingly, the literal term defund was now the singular word she most desperately wished to avoid saying out loud on a debate stage. Yet it was also the exact word she most desperately needed to address to maintain her base. I firmly support the concept of actively reallocating municipal resources toward community-based, she began easily. Yes or no, Shapiro cut in swiftly. Do you support actively lowering police department budgets? Because that is the literal official definition of what defund means. Yes or no? It is simply not a black and white yes or no issue, she parried, attempting to obscure the lines. It is entirely a two-way question, he countered instantly. You either support slashing police budgets or you do not. The President of the United States makes critical, world-altering yes or no decisions every single day. Launching the nuclear codes is a yes or no decision. Imposing massive economic sanctions is a yes or no decision. Authorizing a global military deployment is a yes or no decision. Can you successfully answer one single yes or no question? The auditorium produced a highly unusual, fascinating sound. It wasn't exactly laughter, and it wasn't exactly applause. It was the strange, uncomfortable hybrid murmur of a massive room watching a purely binary question violently collide with a non-binary, dodging answer, and collectively understanding that the non-binary evasion was, in fact, a destructive answer all on its own. AOC's physical grip on her podium visibly tightened even further. She was now employing a full, white-knuckled, two-handed grip. It was the intense, desperate grip of a person desperately holding onto a podium in the exact same manner a terrified passenger holds onto a steel railing aboard a sinking ship caught in violently rough waters. This intense grip was fully visible to the first 10 rows of the live audience and perfectly captured and showed by every single high-definition television camera operating in the room. Under your proposed Medicare for All legislation, should private health insurance be completely destroyed, yes or no? He fired, refusing to give her a moment to rest. The ultimate goal of the legislation is to slowly and carefully switch. She started. Yes or no? He demanded. Under your specific Medicare for All proposal, do private insurance corporations continue to legally remain in America? Roughly 180 million industrious American citizens currently depend on company-provided health insurance. Do they get to keep their current plans? Yes or no? They would ultimately receive a much better all-inclusive. They would lose it. That is the truthful, legal answer, Shapiro stated firmly, cutting through the rhetoric. Under the strict legal text of your own proposal, the entire private insurance industry is entirely removed. 180 million Americans immediately lose their current medical coverage. You are entirely free to passionately argue that they will eventually receive something superior from the government. That is an entirely separate philosophical policy debate. However, the factual answer to the specific question, do they keep their current plan, is a definitive no, and you simply could not bring yourself to say that word out loud to the voters. He instantly moved to his next question without taking a single breath to pause. His blistering speed was his primary weapon, far more so than the actual content of his meticulously researched questions. The relentless speed ensured that each new question violently arrived before the psychological dust from her previous failed answer had even settled. It felt exactly like crashing ocean waves arriving relentlessly before the previous wave had a chance to recede from the shoreline. The intended cumulative effect of this tactic was not to inflict massive individual moments of damage, but rather to cause slow, methodical, undeniable erosion. It was the gradual, agonizing wearing away of a heavily polished political surface that had been meticulously designed to appear perfectly smooth and impenetrable. Should ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, be completely abolished? Yes or no? Our immigration enforcement systems fundamentally should be completely reformed to reflect. Yes or no? He pressed. To be perfectly clear, you explicitly tweeted, "Abolish ICE" on the 28th of June 2018. That written statement is a definitive yes. Has your political position on this core issue changed since then? Yes or no? Total silence fell over the massive auditorium. 2 full seconds passed in agonizing slow motion. In the high-stakes, rapid-fire format of a live political debate, 2 seconds genuinely feels like an absolute eternity. The massive audience subconsciously registered the uncomfortable pause in the exact same manner a concert audience instantly and viscerally registers a wildly missed note during a symphony performance. They reacted instinctively, armed with the innate understanding that something highly important that was supposed to be present, a confident answer, was glaringly absent. My personal position on the matter has naturally evolved over time, she finally answered weakly. It has evolved from abolish ICE to it's highly complicated in a span of just 4 short years, he noted with a hint of sarcasm. This is the exact same political evolution you experienced regarding the crucial Iron Dome missile defense funding. You went from actively voting to strip the funding, to weeping on the floor and voting present, to demanding we keep the funding, to subsequently demanding we strip the funding once more. Senator Kennedy famously and accurately labeled you a political weather vane. I am beginning to clearly see exactly why AOC's physical posture fundamentally altered in response to the barrage. Her aggressive, standing debate posture, shoulders pulled back, chin held high, body weight leaned aggressively forward, projecting the unmistakable aura of a combative person advancing into the fight, suddenly collapsed. Her physical weight subtly transferred from the balls of her feet squarely back onto her heels. This backward shift was incredibly small, perhaps measuring barely half an inch in total distance. However, this tiny physical shift completely altered her body's natural center of gravity from a forward-leaning, attacking position to a backward-leaning, absorbing position. This subtle physical shift silently communicated a massive psychological defeat. My body is no longer on the offensive. My body is now merely bracing to receive incoming blows. Congresswoman, exactly how many legislative bills have you personally sponsored that were ultimately signed into federal law by the president? The question arrived in the exact same manner all of Shapiro's questions arrived, at breakneck speed, completely lacking any soft prologue or polite intro. There were no drawn-out stories about local constituents, no sentimental memories of growing up in Middletown, Ohio, and no time-wasting rituals like slowly cleaning his eyeglasses all of which were standard features of the older characters in congressional hearing rooms. There was only the sharp, cutting question delivered with the cold precision of a verified fact being presented without a shred of regret. AOC instantly knew the exact number. She had been brutally asked this precise number during 4 previous highly publicized congressional hearings. She had agonizingly sat through 12-second silences while considering this exact number. But in those isolated hearing rooms, she was allowed to comfortably sit in silence and simply wait for the awkward moment to pass. Now, standing uncovered on a debate stage in front of a live paying audience, facing a hyper-aggressive opponent whose next lethal question was already locked and loaded in the barrel, silence was no longer a defensive tool. Silence was a direct admission of complete surrender. Passing strict legislation is absolutely not the singular measure of a representative's political impact in Washington. She fired back, her voice laced with desperation. I have successfully and eternally moved the entire Overton window regarding critical national discussions on climate change, universal health care, and broad economic justice. The Overton window, he repeated flatly, rolling the academic term around. So you have successfully moved a conceptual concept. Obscure concepts absolutely do not put food on the tables of starving people. Hard-passed legislation feeds people. Your official job title is legislator. That word literally originates from the specific act of creating legislation. Exactly how many bills? I have proudly introduced dozens of. She attempted to counter. I did not ask how many you introduced. He cut her off heartlessly. Introducing a bill is nothing. It does not mean passing a bill. I specifically asked how many were signed by the president into actual binding law. How many bills that you personally sponsored are currently enforceable federal law in the United States today? Given the highly toxic political environment, 0, he answered for her, dropping the number like an anvil. The factual answer is 0. In 8 full years of occupying a congressional seat, drawing a taxpayer salary, you have successfully sponsored precisely 0 bills that were signed into law. You aggressively introduced the Green New Deal, which was nothing more than a non-binding resolution that never even received a formal floor vote. You proudly introduced Medicare for All, which also completely failed to ever reach the voting floor. You have boastfully proposed spending $125 trillion in massive new federal expenditures across all of your major campaigns. And yet you have successfully produced absolutely 0 pieces of passed legislation. He dramatically turned his gaze away from AOC and looked directly out into the live audience at the 750 individuals who had paid thousands of dollars to sit in this specific room right at the voters. This woman is the absolute most widely followed member currently serving in the United States Congress. He declared to the hypnotized crowd, she boasts 13 million followers on X and another 8 million devoted followers on Instagram. She is undeniably the most heavily clipped, most frequently quoted, and most intensely screenshotted legislator in the entire history of American politics. And yet, after 8 full years, 8 long years of viral clips, snappy quotes, numerous screenshots, stylish Instagram stories, highly publicized tours claiming to fight the oligarchy, dazzling appearances at the Munich Security Conference, and wearing tailor-made protest dresses to the elite Met Gala, her actual legislative output remains exactly 0. He whipped his head back to face AOC directly, delivering the final blow. Congresswoman, you are undeniably the single most famous do-nothing in the entire history of American political history. And I genuinely mean that statement, not as a petty insult, but as a completely factual clinical diagnosis, because your massive fame and your utter lack of legislative accomplishment are closely connected. You are intensely famous, specifically because you do not waste time legislating. You are famous because you produce content, and content and legislation are vastly different things. Content is a clip that travels before the correction. Legislation is a law that exists after the clip is forgotten. You chose content, and 571,000 backers who give you $16.81 a month think they're paying for legislation. The devastating line, most famous do nothing, landed heavily in the live auditorium. The explosion of gasps, laughter, and processing silence confirmed the impact. AOC's body recoiled another half inch. Suddenly, Shapiro's blistering speaking speed noticeably changed. It slowed down. The slowing was a massive signal. "Congresswoman, I want to step back from the policies for a moment," he said, staring at her with genuine interest. "The question I've been wanting to ask for 8 years is not about any of those things. Do you actually believe any of this?" he asked. He outlined her contradictions. $93 trillion with no funding, abolishing private insurance with no plan, defunding the police until crime rose, and the shifting stances. The pattern is not certainty. Certainty has a direction. The pattern is posturing. And you say whatever the audience requires. He paused, letting the heavy, suffocating atmosphere in the crowded auditorium settle, and genuinely acknowledged her immense, undeniable, generational talent as a public speaker. He admitted that she was arguably better than Ronald Reagan or Barack Obama when placed directly in front of a television camera. But extraordinary gifts can be utilized to effectively communicate truth, or they can be used to simply perform truth, he stated, his voice dropping to a serious, almost mournful register. Performance is a fleeting clip. Truth is a binding law. He then leaned forward, resting his hands on the podium, and pleaded for one specific, concrete answer to one specific, foundational question. Do you actually believe any of it? Give me the basic math. Give me the actual funding mechanism. Give me the realistic transition plan. What immediately followed was absolute, suffocating, crushing silence. In a rigid, highly anticipated debate format, specifically designed by mutual agreement to demand an immediate rhetorical response, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did not speak a single word for 8 agonizing, excruciating seconds. It was without question the loudest, most visibly devastating standing silence in the entire recorded history of modern American political television. She stared desperately and blankly at the neutral veteran moderator, her wide eyes silently pleading for some sort of procedural help or rescue, looking exactly like someone tragically drowning in remarkably shallow water. The moderator, strictly bound by the painstakingly negotiated rules of the evening, did not intervene or offer a lifeline. Shapiro mercilessly and calmly waited the full 8 seconds, letting the immense weight of the silence entirely crush her political facade. "That is exactly what I thought," he finally concluded, slowly stepping back from his microphone with an air of absolute finality. "You fundamentally confused theatrical performance with actual tangible leadership. Thank you for the debate tonight. It was truly worth the 8-year wait." He then deliberately reached out and took a single, defining, theatrical sip of the clear glass of water he hadn't touched for the entire grueling hour. AOC's frantic, desperate 3-minute and 44-second rebuttal was an exercise in pure, unadulterated, energetic performance. She immediately went on the offensive, aggressively attacking his complete lack of formal public political service and passionately claiming her vast cultural impact extended far beyond the mere passage of traditional legislative bills. However, despite the incredible volume and rapid speed of her delivery, her lengthy diatribe contained absolutely zero mathematical answers to his direct numerical questions. Shapiro didn't even bother to offer a counter-response. He just quietly watched her exhaust herself. The resulting viral video clips instantly and permanently destroyed her 2028 presidential campaign aspirations. The global internet was immediately flooded with brutal, inescapable montages. The devastating, most famous do-nothing moniker, the calculator ruthlessly destroying the Green New Deal's fantasy economics, the brutal yes or no interrogation segment, and most fatally of all, those devastating 8 seconds of unbroken standing silence. Prominent political analysts across the entire ideological spectrum universally ask the exact same terrifying question. If a conservative podcaster, armed with nothing but a basic mathematical calculator, could completely dismantle her in an hour, what would a real seasoned state governor do to her in a general election? In a quiet, dimly lit living room in Ohio, a working-class voter named Crystal watched the unedited recording of the debate with cold, absolute clarity. Shapiro directly asked about what she actually believes, and she couldn't answer because true belief requires a concrete plan, and a plan requires solid math, and the math simply doesn't work. And she has absolutely known the math doesn't work for 8 whole years. Crystal concluded quietly to herself. That crushing, endless standing silence proved it beyond any reasonable doubt. Back in the deeply politically charged atmosphere of 2018, she had dismissively and arrogantly called his formal invitation catcalling. He had persistently and respectfully called it a debate. 8 years later, the entire nation finally knew exactly which one it truly was. The final scorecard of the night was simply undeniable. $93 trillion, 0 past bills, 0 factual answers, and 8 deafening seconds of pure, unadulterated silence. That was not catcalling. That was the cold, unforgiving reality of a calculator. God bless the undeniable mathematical calculator.